One of the things I've learned covering electric power is that the most interesting changes often happen quietly, inside projects, companies, and communities experimenting with new ways to run the grid. That's why I started the Energy Changemakers newsletter. Each week, I share reporting and insights about the innovations creating the decentralized grid. If you'd like to follow along, you can subscribe for free at energychangemakers.com. Now let's get to the show. We know the grid is undergoing massive change, which creates massive opportunities for local energy. The Energy Changemakers podcast offers rich conversations with industry leaders to help you and your company capture opportunities to build the decentralized grid. I'm your host, Elisa Wood. Welcome to the Energy Changemakers podcast. Hey everyone, Elisa Wood here. From the outside, from other countries, electricity regulation in the U.S. looks like a big mess. We have 50 states, each with their own set of energy rules, own regulations, own policies, own laws. How do you scale energy technologies and businesses in that kind of chaos? My two guests today will tell you that this messiness is, in fact, our virtue when it comes to distributed energy. And they should know. They recently advised an 18-month effort by the Pew Charitable Trusts that look deeply at what the states are doing. What they found is that the chaos, the variations among the states, has created a kind of sandbox of experimentation and innovation. So out of all this came a distributed energy playbook released today by Pew that offers actionable ideas to scale the technologies. I haven't yet said my guests' names. You'll know them. Audrey Zibelman and Pat Wood III. Pat, besides holding senior executive and board positions at several energy companies, is the former chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and former chairman of the Public Utility Commission of Texas. Audrey was the CEO for the Australian Energy Market Operator, chair of the New York Public Service Commission, CEO at PJM, and a long-time executive at Xcel Energy. So wow, what a great conversation. Here we go. Hey, Audrey and Pat, I am so excited to have you on the show today to talk about this new Pew Playbook. I think we've been waiting for something like this for a long time. Audrey, let me start with you. I want to ask you, from a high level, what does this playbook bring to the table that we haven't seen before? Where does it fit into this ongoing conversation we've been having for a long time about distributed energy?
Hi, Lisa, and it's great to be part of this. This is something that I'm really excited about, too. And it's really all about the fact that in the U.S., we know we have a really complex system with 50 states, et cetera. But we're at an inflection point in the industry where DER and its use in terms of helping us maintain cost, increase reliability, increase the resilience of the grid, the technology is there. Everyone knows it works. The question is, how do we normalize it so that it becomes, in my vernacular, as a regulator would say, good utility practice? And what the playbook does is it says, look, we're going to take as a given the fact that we have very, very different regulatory regimes across the U.S. and market regimes, but the system works sort of the same everywhere. So what could we do at the state levels to adopt policies and practices that allow us to really integrate DER into the system so it can maximize its potential for consumers, regardless of the regime? So it doesn't really matter if you're in a regulated state or a non-regulated state, a market, things should work the same. And so we've laid out several areas, and they fall into three different main categories. One is what I would call what I call normalizing DER as good utility practice, so integrating it into planning and how it gets operated in the regulatory frameworks. What can we do there? The second is eliminate barriers to entry. How do we make it easier, simpler, faster for DER to get integrated in? And the third is really how do we use it for resiliency? We all know how important reliability is. It's getting even more important as we electrify more and more of the economy. So really the playbook is about let's make sure that we're taking advantage of these technologies and the system is more resilient.
And very needed at this point in time. So, Pat, I want to ask you this question. We're seeing NERC's long-term reliability assessments just like flashing warning signs right now. Electricity demand is going upward and upward. Utilities staring down a $1.1 trillion bill in planned capex through 2029. Given all that pressure, why hasn't the business case for distributed energy and virtual power plants already broken through at the utility planning level? And what does this Pew report identify as the core structural reason? Is it technology? Is it cost? Is it something else?
Well, at the bottom, I played a big role in the opening up of the big transmission grid in the U.S. and in Texas in particular, and allowing supply and demand to participate in a competitive way. And so this is really the DER effort is finishing the job, taking it down all the way through the distribution grid to the customer meter. And so we are seeing a lot of history repeating itself, I would say, and that's reflected in our report, the learned lessons. There are differences, of course, but the technology costs are perceived as being high. We actually found out that's more myth than reality, but it's important to use this report to overcome that shibboleth. It's hard to do. You're not building an 800 megawatt gas combined cycle plant. You're using tens of kilowatts of rooftop solar, for example, or distributed backup generation of small amounts and packaging those together. That's transaction cost heavy. And so one of the things we've got to do and have focused on in the report is what can we do to reduce those transaction costs by standardizing things to make it simple to really overcome those barriers, because that's not been done in many places. So we've not really finished or even started the work of reducing those barriers to entry, whether they're regulatory, whether they're just the way business has always been done and this is something new and, oh gosh, we have to figure that out. I don't think it's intentional. It wasn't intentional on the big grid either. There wasn't an overt discrimination against wind energy. It just was the rules were written for a world that didn't have them. So that's where we are now. The rules were written. The distribution grid was a one-way grid that ran from the substation to your house or your business. That's changing. And so that mindset requires a lot of the old ways of doing business to be fully addressed and revisited and rewritten. And so that's really what we're pointing out. At the end of the day, the utility is our enabler. We need the utility to really be that foundation on which the distributed energy resource world can roll out and thrive. And so, like all things, you want to show the utility how it can make money doing that work. And so we've got to make sure that utility incentives are aligned with DER deployment. So we speak to all these things in our report, but that's why we're not really getting it done, Elisa, is that it's a new thing that, like all new things, requires people to do more hard work. We can do hard things, but you generally want to try to do the easy things first. It's time now to do the hard things.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And it just goes back to that line you often hear in this industry that the technology is moving fast and the regulation isn't moving as quickly. It's tougher, takes a long time for it to catch up, and we're kind of at that point, I think. Also, I got to say, I love the fact that I'm talking to the two of you because you bring so much history to all of this. So thank you for that.
That's a nice way of saying we're old.
I'm not going to buy that one.
Old is good when it comes to understanding utility, regulation, and where this all came from. So, Audrey, let me go back to you for a second. The report makes the argument about cost of service regulation, creating a structural bias toward capital investment. And we all talk about this a lot, that utilities have an incentive to build poles and wires and transformers over DER procurement. So let's talk a little more history. You oversaw New York's REV framework, Reforming the Energy Vision, which tried to address exactly this. Looking back, how far do you think REV actually moved utility behavior? And what would you do differently in designing this next generation of performance incentive mechanisms?
Great question. So I think that what we looked at doing in REV, and that was around moving utilities away from just thinking about how to spend capital, but thinking about capital productivity, which is, as we know in competitive businesses, that's the way they think about things, is making sure that they're getting the most out of each dollar spent in terms of value back to shareholders as well as customers. And what we tried to look at in REV was to realize there was a natural bias And that one way to eliminate that bias is to align utility shareholder interests much more with customer interests and give utilities the same economic reward for using less capital of their own capital and making better use of other investments in order to materially both reduce cost of service as well as get value back to customers. So that was the ideal. I think the things that I would do differently, and I wouldn't say we should have done it at the time, but certainly as things evolved, and I think one of the lessons learned is regulation should never be stagnant. I think there's always this tension between certitude, because you need to invest, and then also rigidity, which prevents you from altering things, even when it flies in the face of the fact that you're not getting the experiential results that you would like to get. And I think that in this case, what we need to do with where we're moving with distributed energy resources is setting up a series of economic outcomes so that utilities are rewarded for aligning themselves with what we want to do. And so the thing we didn't do in REV, we looked at adoption of DER, but we didn't look at utilization. One of the things that I think we need to start thinking about, it's not just how much solar and batteries you have on your roof and in your house, or how much DER is in your system, but how you're using it. And having outcomes that are predicated on the ability to economically use DER will get utilities thinking about what different types of resources they should be using. The second, I think we need to be thinking about is how do we align ourselves better with affordability and rate moderation. The biggest concern, and it's a huge issue that we have to deal with, is the fact that we have to spend a lot of money in the near term that is creating huge pressure. One of the things that the report identifies is that throughout the U.S., we're seeing 6% rate increases up to double-digit rate increases. That is a huge problem for consumers, because the thing that's different really about this is that from a consumer basis, even as we're electrifying, the question is how much wallet share can we afford to have energy pay in our overall income? So thinking about how you can use utilities to do rate moderation using DER better are the types of outcomes that the report identifies that regulators can start thinking about. And that requires something we didn't do in REV, which is thinking about multi-year rate cases. I've always been enamored the way Ofgem sets up its rate-making regime, because it allows for these multi-year plans. And we did the same thing in Australia, which allows then the utilities to adapt and adopt changes and not have to come back for rate cases, which then allows us to use rate moderation and price moderation as one of the vehicles to enable change. Because one of the things, as Pat said, that utilities are going to have to change the way they operate. They're going to have to change their investments in software. They're going to have to change the ways they dispatch their system. All of those are going to take multi-year investment. And if you have rate cases that only look out a certain amount of time, you're not going to allow for that kind of adaptation that we need to have occur.
Let me stop to share something I've noticed after years covering electric power. The real story of how the grid is changing hardly ever shows up in a single headline. It's happening piece by piece in microgrids, solar, virtual power plants, and new market models that reshape how electricity works. That's what I track in the Energy Changemakers newsletter. Each week, I break down the most important developments in distributed energy and explain what they mean for the industry and the world. Recent issues have looked at the rise of data center microgrids, controversies over virtual power plants, and why balcony solar shouldn't be ignored. So if you enjoy this podcast and want a clear weekly briefing on where the power system is heading, you can subscribe for free at energychangemakers.com. That's energychangemakers.com. Now let's get back to the conversation. So we have to consider the utility business model. We can't just say, hey, you've got to go out and do this. Someone said to me the other day, you can't just keep beating them over the head. You've got to give them incentive. And it's easy, I guess, to look back. Hindsight's always great, right? And the world's changed a bit since REV too. Quite a bit.
Right. And one of the things we look to do in REV is, and I think we need to do this, is we have to think about the fact that utilities make a lot of money investing in capital. How can we make it that utility shareholders get just as much value out of helping customers save money as they do investing in capital. And that's where these DER programs and VPP programs can much better align that. And then we can also do regulatory alignment so that utilities, rather than being disincented from DER adoption, are actually incented.
Pat, do you want to address that? What do you think? How much of the slowdown here is institutional resistance inside utilities versus regulatory design?
I know from my own experience, utilities, the transmission company is actually separate from the distribution company. They're both regulated. They're both traditional utilities, as word works in really every market. But they're different mindsets. Like I said, the big grid has always been a two-way grid. There's always, at least now for a generation, been competitive generation on there, and utilities are having to deal with not only the stuff that their affiliate or their company owns, but everybody else's. So there's a mindset of, hey, we're enabling our business and everybody else's at the same time. That is not the case at the distribution level. The distribution level is a different mindset. It is very reliability centered. It is very much keep the lights on, keep the vegetation managed, read the meters, render the bills, and flow the power 24/7, 365. It's a different mindset as to what the priority of the business is. So a mindset change is necessary at the distribution level as well. I mean, Audrey lived through that in New York. I'm seeing that more now as we're trying to get DERs rolled out across Texas, which is where I'm active. It's a culture issue. Again, it's not mean or overt. It's just this is the business that we're asking to do different things than they've done for the last century. And so that takes a little bit of time. And that's why we wanted to focus in a comprehensive way, recognizing that every part of the country has a little bit different structure as to how the businesses are deployed and regulated. There's a lot of commonality here that could benefit from a common approach that would reduce costs and open up benefits much faster.
The other thing the report does, and you mentioned REV, and I think we all have reasons for optimism. We're seeing a lot of really interesting things happening across the country, different approaches that states are taking. And what we're looking to do in the report is call these out. And I see a lot of innovation that's occurring. That's exciting. And what we want to do is make sure that everyone doesn't feel they have to reinvent the wheel, but can we get to a common approach, picking up on some of the themes we're seeing and make it then easier for states to adopt it, but more importantly, then for technologists to be able to deliver solutions, because that's where they can reduce the cost of entry and the cost of production if the markets look very much the same. And by providing these pathways, I think our objective would be to drive the cost down for DER adoption everywhere.
So yeah, it creates some great examples for people to take a look at. But one of the problems we have in the US is we have sort of a fragmented system. I remember being at a conference many years ago and renewable energy was just kind of starting to take off. And there were a lot of European journalists at the conference, and it was in the US, the conference. And I remember one of them standing up and he was asking why we have all these states with different regulatory bodies. He said, why don't you just have one to make it easier? And it was like everybody in the US kind of chuckled. That's such a big question to ask. But let's talk about that we have a state-by-state approach to distributed energy regulation in general. Is this a virtue or a vice in the US? Does it help or hurt us move these kind of technologies forward?
So certainly, I think that when it comes to these types of the P policy types adoptions, the challenge that we've always had in the U.S. is the fragmented regulatory market we have created by the roles of the states versus the roles of the federal government, and the fact that each state has its own set of regulatory rules that it lives by. A lot of commonality between them, but a lot of differences too. And it's much easier if you're in Europe or the UK, as the example I use, where Ofgem regulates everything and is part of government and says, this is our policy, this is how we're going to implement it, and then goes ahead and does it. Yes, that's true. The question that we've asked ourselves in the report, and I think, as Pat said, we started with the hard question, how do we take the world as it is rather than try to change it and provide pathways so that the differences between the states become less relevant? And the thing that I always begin with is electrons don't vote. They're not red. They're not blue. And they work the same everywhere. So these systems we put around them are systems. And the question is there a thread that can go through all of that? to create this commonality. And the report is really focused on how we can make that happen.
Yeah, and we were real mindful of the fact, I came from Texas, and we're probably the most open, competitive state of the 50. But when I went to FERC, my remit was smaller. It wasn't the full regulated business like we were able to do in kind of the unique aspects of ERCOT, but it was what was under the FERC's authority under the Federal Power Act. And what the Federal Power Act gave to FERC, and not to the states, was authority over wholesale power, so sales for resale, and over transmission. And so most people have just always assumed that those things were kind of hand in hand the same thing. They're not. We focused on transmission open access to open up the power grid and to enable the wholesale market, and kind of conflated those two things. But what has happened over time and subsequent FERCs have explored and pushed and courts have approved, which is that the wholesale jurisdiction, the sale of power for resale, is quite broad and doesn't just limit itself to what's on the transmission grid, but can go deep into the system. So as FERC found under its Order 2222 a few years back, there is the ability to utilize these small packets of power, whether it's through a virtual power plant or some other distributed form of generation, and let that participate in the wholesale market from a low voltage system. So it's not easy, like off-gem and pretty, but it's one that I, for my career, have had to wrap my mind around because that's what I've got. And I do say, just as an American, I do like the federal system. Messy though it may be, it does allow for us to have a few oops moments that we might have got this wrong in Idaho, but Utah figured it out. Louisiana tripped over the root, but Tennessee got it right. So you've got these abilities to experiment and see which of these models works best. It's the problem of once you find one that works best, can you scale that and move it quickly across the nation? Nothing moves quick in this power business due to the regulatory structure, but it does allow us to really shop around and find the best answer. So that's why we wanted in this report to kind of jumpstart that by putting spotlights on programs. And there are programs that I never dreamed were going on. That's what was fun for me as our role, and Audrey and I had co-chairing this effort, was really discovering what's out there. Because part of the story to get things moving is let people know it's been done and it's been working well somewhere else with this mindset and this program, and let people learn from the successes in this laboratory called federalism and start copying each other. But we just want to accelerate the copying process of take the best practices, let's put them on steroids and get going.
I think, Elisa, if there's any takeaway that we get from this podcast, it's Pat's last point. I wouldn't necessarily say we should move. I would at all suggest we move. It's easier if you have one regulator, but it doesn't necessarily evolve to the best ideas. And I think the experimentation that the states are doing is really valuable. And our framework is a framework. It's really to try to say, here are some big ideas that are going to be really important to the success of any program. But within that, it's continuing to allow this to evolve, because I think we would be cutting ourselves short if we didn't continue to look at how we can change and how to move things better. And at the same time, navigate that tension of where there is commonality and the ability to do lessons learned, so we all don't have to start off pretending like we're the first ones who have thought about this.
Yeah, I've heard people say that we have chaos, but we also have 50 labs. So it's a great advantage in bringing out ideas. Let me talk about one idea in particular that has come up recently. And this gets back to utilities again. So, Pat, you mentioned that utilities are enablers for distributed energy for these new programs. We need to see them that way. But then there's kind of another angle to that. And people are concerned in the competitive arena that utilities will have too much control over distributed energy. And I want to point to one circumstance in particular, and that is the BPP program in Minnesota. I noticed the report did talk about Xcel's virtual power plant in Colorado and provided it as one example. But Xcel has another program in Minnesota, which is a little bit different in that the utility owns the batteries in the virtual power plant, unlike the Xcel Colorado program, where the customer owns the batteries. How do you see that conflict? Do we need to worry about the utilities having too much control of them pushing out the competitive market?
First of all, having run the Xcel Power system in Minnesota, I always feel like this is back to the future for me. In 1998, actually, when I was running the system, we did a program where Xcel, at that point was Northern States Power Company, the subsidiary in Minnesota, had access to centralized air conditioners. It was an energy efficiency program. And we used it at a couple summers in aggregate. We didn't use the term VPP because that didn't exist, in order to shift away from peak because we were having problems with meeting peak. It was a very hot summer. So I feel like this is, in a certain sense, just an evolution of what the way Xcel or Minnesota used to always operate its program. But in my view, what we need to do is make sure that we allow for the fact that there are going to be these different approaches. And the real critical piece is how can we get transparency into the network in terms of allowing for everyone to understand why we're doing certain things and why the location is right. So from a planning perspective and an operational perspective, I totally get the idea that if utilities can look at how to use firming and they can aggregate these batteries so that they can shift demand or they can accommodate much more DER in their system because they can manage the system much more efficiently and because utilities can be cheap sources of capital, why Minnesota would go that direction. And it also allows for speed. So that makes terrific sense. At the same time, you can achieve the same results if you have really good plans and procurement models that allow third parties to put in those investments and get the advantage of maybe their operational know-how that the utility might not have, but still give the utility the ability to use those resources as a way of driving efficiency through those networks. Back to our point, I could understand why various regulators may come up with different outcomes. And of course, Minnesota is a fully integrated state. It doesn't have markets. So why the state would go in that direction? At the same time, I think the good about that is if we can get into elements of a great deal of clarity around planning, great deal of clarity of how batteries can use for DER adoption, and then drive different ways so that third parties might be able even to come into Minnesota and partner with the utilities because they might have different ways to get to the same good. You're sort of on the same pathway of where you're going to go. And I feel like we can get over focused on this is good and this is not good, when in fact, if the goal is here to show how we can use storage in the distribution system to drive efficiency, drive economics, drive greater DER adoption. And there's different test cases or use cases that evidence how it works. Then we could evolve the market so that we could not only get the best in terms of how it's used, but also get the best innovators into these markets so that we continue to improve both the storage technology and its use in the system. There's a long way of saying, I don't think we should get hysterical about it. I think that's a method. What we're trying to do in our report is say there are multiple methods to get to the same goal, but the prize is maximizing use of DER to drive down costs, increase reliability, increase resiliency.
Fantastic. So let me ask you one last question. What would you tell policymakers who are starting to implement these programs to watch for? You've both worked in the field forever. What could throw them off? What would throw off what looks like a good plan?
Well, I think I would build on this last one is I think you want to let a million flowers bloom, but if you're putting the thumb on the scale that basically says the utility wins or this particular provider that won an RFP is the only one that gets to do this work, then you really lose the benefits of what, having multiple creative entrepreneurial players come into the market, what they bring. That's my personal preference. Obviously, the state defines who plays. If a state says that this is the way it works, then we've got to respect that. And that's what this report really reflects. But I do want to encourage those states that are embarking on this to think expansively and think about what has worked so well on the transmission open access grid on the big generation side and big demand. Let's copy that. I mean, we've been here before. We know how this can be done on an electric grid that requires everything to be done in basically real time. Now let's just scale it down and disaggregate it at the distribution level. So that's what I'd say to the policymakers now is just learn the lessons that we learned from the big grid and make sure that you include as many people around the table as possible, because you'll get a better plan when you consult broadly, but make decisive conclusions so that people can get into the market quickly and get going, because you don't want this thing to take a generation to do. That's too long. We don't have that luxury in this country with the energy expansion that's underway as we speak. We've got to get every electron at the table now and get going. So I would just say that is keep it inclusive and keep it broad and make firm decisions quickly. They might, some of them, be wrong, but speed honestly is better than accuracy in getting these markets opened up to a broad number of providers. Audrey?
Yeah, we've talked a lot in the industry about the trends around data center driving demand growth as well as electrification. It's very clear that if I look at it from the perspective of not just the utilities, but you're seeing a lot of infrastructure investors coming into the industry, which is, I think, a good thing because they're bringing new capital that's in. The thing that we have an opportunity to do now, because we have so much to spend and we can't avoid the fact that we have to make a lot of investment, is how do we do it wisely? And the objective for me, people used to talk about the green premium, and I think we've proven that there's really not a green premium, but there continues to be a risk premium that we're paying for in this industry when we have uncertainty and lack of clarity. And to me, the objective of what we can try to achieve now is that if we look at doing the transformation that just needs to happen in the industry, but doing it in a way that maintains affordability as one of the major cornerstones of what we need to achieve, we should be doing everything we can to reduce the cost of the transformation. And DER plays a big role, as does regulation and markets that provide for that certitude, that eliminate the risk premium that we would otherwise pay, which turns into costs that customers pay for in their rates. And I think what we're trying to achieve with this report, while we're excited about it, is identifying those elements that make the transformation from a highly centralized to a distributed grid more certain, less risky, and allowing for these outcomes that remain constant, which energy has to be affordable, it has to be reliable, and we need a resilient system because we need to keep the lights on.
Fantastic. And it is a really interesting report. I encourage everybody to take a look at the Policy Playbook for Distributed Energy at Scale. We'll have a link to it up on our site. Thank you so much, Pat and Audrey. You are just an incredible asset to this industry and have been for decades. So appreciate your continued work.
Thank
Thanks,
you, Elisa.
Elisa.
Thank you for joining us today on the Energy Changemakers podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think differently about the role of distributed energy in our society. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform and consider leaving us a review. You can help us shape the dialogue around energy. Go to energychangemakers.com, subscribe to our newsletter, and join our community. Together, we can make a real difference in how quickly we can make our grid local, equitable, and clean.